Pokémon Platinum, one of the hardest Pokémon games ever made. And I wanted to make it even harder. So, I tried to beat it, without ever dealing any damage. And somehow, I'm about to win. The rules for this challenge are quite simple. If a move does any damage, I can't use it, meaning I can only use moves that are classed as status moves. This means no tackle, no flamethrower, no earthquake, and to make it that little bit harder, even no struggle. The only ways I can really deal damage are using status effects such as poison or burn, weather like sandstorm, or forcing the opponents to struggle themselves. This means that every battle I do is a big puzzle. Everything has to be planned, and if I run out of PP, I lose. Another rule that I followed was using no healing items during a battle. That means I couldn't use potions, I couldn't use status heals, and I couldn't use revives. I allowed myself to use items like leftovers or berries as long as they were held, and I could use heals outside of a battle, but never in one. So, with that out of the way, this is how I beat Pokémon Platinum without ever doing damage. After meeting my rival Barry and heading off to get my first Pokémon, I picked Turtwig, mainly because of the status moves it gets later on. But that didn't go so well. I couldn't even beat him in the very first battle. The problem was, his Chimchar kept using Leer, because I kept using Withdraw. And because of that, I'd wear down all of my Withdraw PP before I fainted, meaning I'd have to use an attack. So after a few failed attempts, I swapped to Chimchar instead, and that made a huge difference. With Chimchar, I was finally able to beat Barry, get my Pokédex, and access the first real challenge of the game. Now that I was into the first real routes of the game, I had a real problem: beating trainers. Unlike Barry, I couldn't lose these fights and still progress. If I lost, I'd had to reset back to my last save. So I came up with a genius strategy. It really wasn't, it was really stupid. By throwing Pokeballs at opposing trainers, I'd be able to waste a turn while they still attacked, and doing this let me wear down their PP without wearing down any of my own and forcing me to struggle. And this way I could stall them out, and once they lost all their PP, they'd start to struggle and knock themselves out. It was painfully slow, but in the end it worked, and thanks to that I made it to Jubilife and Auburg City. After this, I picked up a Zubat and a Budu, two Pokemon that would be instrumental for the rest of the game. Zubat immediately gave me access to Supersonic, which allowed me to start chipping away at enemies before they got down to struggle. And with Budu, once I evolved it, it would get Leech Seed and Stun Spore, two absolute lifesavers. Leech Seed would let me slowly drain HP whilst I was healing myself, and Stun Spore locked down enemies so I could keep stalling. The only issue with that is, Budu only learns Leech Seed once it evolves, and it's at level 16. So I had to spend hours running in circles and stalling against wild Pokemon in the mines just to boost its happiness and level it up enough. But eventually I managed to evolve it, and I was ready to take on the first gym. With that setup, I took on Roark, and honestly, it wasn't too bad. I started off against Geodude and Onix, and with both of them I set up Leech Seed and then Stun Spore to paralyse them, and I waited for the health to drain. But then came Cranados. He was the real threat. He hits like a truck, so I had to swap in Zubat to confuse it using Supersonic and hope it would hit itself in confusion. And eventually it did, and after about 10 hours of setup, grinding and resets, I finally managed to get my first badge, and with Roark down, I could start heading toward Gardenia. On the way to Gardenia, I picked up another useful Pokemon, Wurmple. It first evolved into a Silcoon, which wasn't what I wanted, so I got a second one, and luckily that one did evolve into a Cascoon. I kept it in my party until it became Dustox, and soon I'll have a strong early game wall with some crucial moves. At the Valley Windworks, I ran into Commander Mars. She actually beat me on my first attempt, but after a reset I stalled her out with Leech Seed and ended up taking the win. And around that time I also caught a Drifloon as well, mainly because it gets Confuse Ray, which is far more reliable than my current Supersonic. Then I moved on to Eterna Forest, which actually turned out to be a really good grind spot. Since I can't control my partner's Pokemon, Chansey would actually attack the opponents, and since every fight was a 2v2, I was getting double the experience. Thanks to that, I quickly evolved Cascoon into Dustox, Golbat from Zubat, and I leveled Roselia and Dustox all the way up to level 28, where Roselia learns Toxic Spikes and Dustox learns Moonlight and Whirlwind, moves that will be vital for the Gardenia fight. Gardenia's team is entirely grass-type Pokemon, so I couldn't use Leech Seed. I had to rely on Toxic Spikes instead. I started by setting down 2 layers of Toxic Spikes, and then I used Whirlwind with Dustox to shuffle her team and ensure every switch-in was badly poisoned. That quickly handled her Turtwig and Cherubi, but her Roserade was the problem. Because it's a grass and poison type, it was immune to both Leech Seed and Toxic. So I paralysed it and slowly chipped away at it using Confusion, healing with Moonlight whenever needed. It was a long battle, but eventually I earned the Forest Badge and could start heading towards Fantina. With Gardenia out of the way, I went back into Eterna Forest and I explored the old chateau to catch a Rotom. It wouldn't be a permanent team member, but with Confuse Rain double team, it made for a solid staller this early on. I also climbed into Mount Coronet to grab another key support Pokemon, Bronzor. After that, I stormed Team Galactic's building and took down Jupiter and picked up the Togepi egg from Cynthia. I also spent some time running around to hatch the egg, and even more time grinding Friendship, and eventually Golbat evolved into Crobat, and Togepi was almost ready to evolve too. Once I reached Hearthome City, I wasted 5 minutes in the contest hall talking to Fantina before I could actually access the gym. Now, Fantina was a different kind of challenge. Toxic Spikes are useless against Flying types, Steel types, Poison types, and even Pokemon with Levitate. And unfortunately, all 3 of her Pokemon have Levitate, which meant I couldn't use it for this fight. I had to go back to the basics, so I opened with Leech Seed, followed by Stun Spore, and then Confuse Ray to take them down. Her Mismagius though was especially dangerous. It had Psychic and Ghost type coverage that was super effective against almost all the good members of my team, but after some careful pivoting and switching, I got through it. I secured the badge, but the fight was a wake-up call that I couldn't get complacent with my strategy. After beating Fantina, I moved towards Route 209, where Barry stopped me for a battle. I quickly dealt with him and moved on to get my next Pokemon, a Duskull I found in the wild, and Spiritomb. Because I'm playing this on an emulator, I couldn't use the normal online method to get Spiritomb. So after I collected the odd keystone from the Karate Man, this version of Platinum allows me to instantly fight Spiritomb. But don't worry, he doesn't stay on the team for long. Whilst I was continuing my way to Veilstone City, Togepi eventually evolved into Togetic, and after arriving, I went straight for the gym. Maylene was another tough battle. To start, I paralysed her Meditite and used Roselia to get Leech Seed up and set down 2 layers of Toxic Spikes. However, she then went down, meaning one of my key Pokemon was missing. After this, I switched into Duskull and stalled it out whilst it fainted from Leech Seed. She then brought out Machoke, who was immediately hit with the Toxic. I switched into Bronzor to tank his hits, and he too went down. However, Lucario was up next, and this was a big problem. Because Lucario is a Steel type, he isn't affected by poison, and with Roselia down, I couldn't use Leech Seed, so I used the next part of my plan. Duskull has the move Curse. Now, normally, using Curse will lower the user's speed in trade for increasing their attack and their defense by 1 stage. However, when it's used by a Ghost type, Curse will cause the user to lose half their HP, and in turn, it'll curse the opponent, causing them to lose 1/4 of their HP each turn, and the only way to remove it is by switching out, which now Lucario can't do. So after this, I stalled a few more turns and Lucario went down, giving me the win. After the gym, I ran into Dawn, who was being hassled by 2 Team Galactic grunts. Me and her cleaned them up, and Looker conveniently appeared just after to find the HM fly for me. Before leaving Veilstone, I hit the department store to grab some TMs, Reflect, Light Screen, and Protect. I also flew down to Route 2010 to pick up Roost. But then, it was onto the Valor Lakefront and down to Pastoria City, where I stopped by the Great Marsh when I got there to grab 2 Barrels as HM mules. Outside the gym, Barry challenged me again, and like the rest of this challenge, I wiped his team without too much trouble, but then I stepped up to face Crasher Wake. Very quickly, I realised I was far too underleveled for this fight. I managed to beat Gyarados, but Floatzel swept the rest of my team without much effort. So I went to grind on Route 212, and while training, Bronzor finally evolved, and after that, I was ready for a rematch. I came back to Wake for round 2 and got my plan in order. I started out with Roselia and immediately paralysed Gyarados. I set up Leech Seed to heal and managed to get 2 layers of Toxic Spikes due to a low damage roll from one of Gyarados' moves. But then Roselia went down. I then brought out Dustox and used Whirlwind, and it brought out Quagsire onto the field, where he was hit by the Toxic. After this, I switched into Bronzong and used Iron Defense to stall him out. After he went down, Gyarados came back, and I switched into Togetic and confused him. Then I used Metronome because I got cocky, and I got a lucky Rock Cracker which finished him off. But finally, Floatzel came out. I switched into Duskull to use Curse before he went down. And finally, I brought Crobat to confuse him and wait for him to faint. And after a second attempt, I obtained the Fen badge. Right after I left the gym, Team Galactic set off a bomb in the Great Marsh. I chased the grunt down to the Valor lakefront, battled him there, and after I won, I ran into Cynthia, who handed me the medicine to heal the Psyducks on Route 210. With the path cleared, I entered the foggy route and battled my way through. And along the way, Duskull finally evolved into Dusclops. After arriving in Celestic Town, Cynthia's grandmother explained to me about the ruins and warned me that Cyrus was already inside. I tried to decline his challenge, but he wasn't in the mood to take no for an answer. So I battled him. And lost. It wasn't a leveling issue, I just underestimated him. His team hit much harder than I expected, and Roselia couldn't really do anything. She was weak to almost everything he had. So I went back to the drawing board, and that's when I realised Dusclops actually learns Will-O-Wisp. You see, a burn status doesn't only deal chip damage, it also halves a Pokemon's physical attack stat, and that one move changed the whole fight. I burned each of Cyrus's Pokemon, confused them, and slowly stalled them down, and eventually Cyrus gave in, and Cynthia's grandmother handed over the HM for Surf, which allowed me to get to Carnivale City. I headed left across Route 218 until I reached Carnivale City, and just as I was about to cross the bridge, Barry asked me for a battle, and unlike previous times, he was actually a challenge. After losing 3 times, I locked in a strategy to help me win. Barry always started off with Staraptor, which would spam double team, and it made it impossible for me to open with Roselia. So, I led with Bronzong, which knew Hypnosis and put it to sleep. Then I swapped into Roselia to set up Leech Seed and 2 layers of Toxic Spikes. And after that I switched to Dusclops and burnt the Staraptor after it woke up, and soon he went down. Next was Heracross, who was badly poisoned after switching in, and after being stalled for a bit, he also went down, and the same with Rapidash after he was confused. Then Empoleon came out. Since he's a Steel type, he was immune to the Toxic Spikes, so I brought Roselia in to Leech Seed it and burnt it using Will-O-Wisp. And after stalling it with Bronzong, they both fainted, and his own Roserade came out. I used Curse on it and then put it to sleep and brought out Togetic to wait out its last few turns, and after a few attempts, Barry was beaten. Before I could get to the gym, I had to go through Iron Island, but luckily there was 2 things I actually needed. Firstly, a Steelix, and secondly, a Shiny Stone. After managing to pick both of them up on the island with some help from Riley, I evolved Togetic into Togekiss using the new Shiny Stone, and got ready to take on Byron. Since Byron uses Steel types, I wouldn't be able to poison them, and my new Steelix couldn't use Sandstorm on them either. So when Magneton came out first, I paralysed him with Stun Spore and used Leech Seed before switching to Steelix to set up Stealth Rock Chip and tank some damage. And when Magneton finally went down, Byron's own Steelix came out, so I brought Roselia back in to use Leech Seed and then Dusclops to burn it before stalling it even more with Crobat's Confuse Ray. Then it was time for Bastiodon. After setting up yet another Leech Seed, I brought out Crobat again to use Confuse Ray, but he got taunted. You see, when a Pokemon uses Taunt, it stops the enemy Pokemon from using any status moves, and considering my Pokemon only know status moves, it made my Crobat unable to attack, so I was forced to switch into my new Togekiss and put it to sleep. And then, after using Sweet Kiss to confuse it, he woke up and hit himself in confusion, giving me the win. After beating Byron, I met Professor Rowan, Dawn and Barry in the library, and this time Team Galactic set off another bomb, but at Lake Valor, so I headed straight there to stop them. After clearing out a few grunts, I went into the Valor Cavern and fought Commander Saturn. His entire team was immune to Toxic, so after starting with Roselia to plant Leech Seed, I'd swap into Dusclops and use Will-O-Wisp to burn them. Then I'd switch into Crobat to use Substitute, which I got from the Game Corner, to tank hits until they also come to the burn. I ran over to Lake Verity, where I beat up a few more grunts, and found Dawn about to take on Commander Mars, so I stepped in to help. She had the same team as Saturn, except she had a Perugly instead of a Toxicroak. So I used the same strategies I did for Saturn, except I used Toxic on Perugly when it came out, and once again quickly finished her off. After this, I was told I'd need to go to the Acuity lakefront, so I headed up to Snowpoint City so I could beat the gym leader and get Rock Climb. Once I entered her gym, I spent almost 20 minutes trying to figure out a children's puzzle, but eventually I did it, and I was finally ready to take her on. I started out with a Bronzong, and she led with Sneasel, which I quickly put to sleep with Hypnosis, and then switched into Roselia to layer Toxic Spikes and Leech Seed. Whilst it was still asleep, I brought Dusclops in to confuse it and applied a burn to it when it finally woke up, and shortly after that, Sneasel went down. Next to hit the field was Frostlass, so I used Steelix to tank hits and set up Sandstorm to remove the hail. After also laying down stealth rocks, I used rock polish to stall turns, and after 3 lucky blizzard misses, Frostlass went down, only hitting 1 attack, letting me finish that fight cleanly. Pillorswine was up next, and he was immune to Sandstorm, so I switched Bronzong back in and set a Reflect to protect myself from its Stone Edge. After doing that, Dusclops came back in to confuse it, and for good measure I disabled its Earthquake. I brought Roselia in one final time for another Leech Seed, and then brought Steelix back to take some hits. He fainted near the end, but Crobat was able to take it on for the last few turns. Finally, her Abomasnow came out and was hit with Toxic. I tried to set up a curse, but I got finished off with Wood Hammer before I could use a move. I thought I was about to lose, but luckily Crobat came in clutch with Substitute and Roost to help me clear the gym. After clearing the gym, I taught Rock Climb to one of my Bibberels and climbed up the rock side to reach the lake, but before going in I picked up the Reaper Cloth next to the entrance. To evolve Dusclops normally, you have to trade it holding the Reaper Cloth, but since I can't do that, once I got the Reaper Cloth, my version of the game allows me to use it directly on Dusclops and evolve him fully into Dusknoir. Then I entered the lakefront and witnessed Barry get beaten by Jupiter. After she walked past, she told me not to bother going to the headquarters. So I did exactly that. However, before I took on the headquarters, I spent a bit of time getting some useful items now that I had Rock Climb. I got a second Shiny Stone from Route 210 to evolve Roselia into Roserade. I got the TM for Roar from Route 213 for Steelix. And finally, I got the TM for Taunt from Route 211. After this, I got the key to the headquarters from the warehouse, and after going straight in, I saw Cyrus giving a speech, and after fighting my way through, I finally managed to reach him and fought him for a second time. His team was stronger this time, but now that I had the move Toxic and not just Toxic Spikes, it made it a bit simpler. He started out with Sneasel again, but I started with Roserade and immediately used Toxic and Leech Seed. After taking some heavy damage from an Ice Punch, I brought in Bronzong to set up Light Screen and Reflect, but he was immediately frozen. Luckily, Toxic and Leech Seed managed to take him down whilst I was frozen. Then Crobat came out. Since I couldn't poison him, I used my new Dusknoir to use Will-O-Wisp and burn him, after missing once. Dusknoir was knocked out, so I brought in Bronzong to tank a hit. Then switched into Togekiss, who, after Cyrus used a full restore, I used Metronome and got lucky with a Fire Punch, which burned him again. Lastly was Honchkrow. Roserade got for Toxic before fainting to Nightshade, and Steelix came in to finish the job with Sandstorm and Protect, stalling out the poison. After beating Cyrus, he handed over the Master Ball, which I'd keep for later, and told me I could go and free the Lake Trio. So I went to do that. But just before I could free them, I was challenged by Saturn, and it caught me off guard. Since I'd just finished the Cyrus fight, half my team was fainted, and after a quick trip to the Pokemon Center, I came back for a round 2. Saturn there with Golbat. I paralysed it and planted Leech Seed before switching to Bronzong to tank a few hits while Golbat went down. When Bronzor came in next, I switched to Dusknoir and burned it with Will-O-Wisp, but after taking some big damage, I rotated Roserade back in to drop another Leech Seed before Bronzor went down. Finally, Toxicroak came out and immediately wiped Roserade before she could use Leech Seed again. So I sent in Dusknoir and used Curse with Will-O-Wisp, and then switched into Togekiss to stall the final few turns. After this, I was able to free the Lake Trio and was told about Cyrus's plan at the top of Mount Coronet. So, I swapped Bronzong out my party and started climbing to the top. After a couple of trips up and down the mountain to heal, I finally beat all the grunts and was challenged to a double battle by Mars and Jupiter. Luckily, Barry showed up just in time to help me out, and after a lot of stalling and a couple of close calls, we managed to take them down. But that wasn't the end. Following the battle, Cyrus summoned the Creation Pokémon and was pulled into the Distortion world. Cynthia arrived soon after, and we jumped in straight after him. After making my way through the Distortion world, I was able to reach the end, and here I found Cyrus, corrupt with insanity, and a team to prove it. This fight was by far the hardest I had in this challenge. All of his Pokémon had moves that countered mine, and due to me needing HMs to reach him, I had to bring a Bibarel that couldn't even fight. This battle ended up taking over half my total resets, and including grinding to level up my Pokémon, it took over the course of 4 days to even stand a chance. So here's what happened. In my first encounter with Cyrus, I actually felt quite confident. So far, no team had really posed a truly difficult challenge. Normally I'd lost due to a mistake or not being prepared for the fight, but this battle very quickly showed me why this challenge was so hard. I opened with Roserade into his Houndoom. After using turn 1 Toxic, I was brought down to 13 HP with a single Flamethrower. I switched into Steelix hoping to tank a hit, but he went down the same turn he switched in. Then came Bibarel, purely to stall a turn with Toxic, followed by Togekiss. Just as Houndoom was about to fade, Cyrus used a full restore. At this point, I'd lost half my team's health and I hadn't even taken down a single Pokémon. Eventually, I got lucky with Metronome, pulling Revenge and Seismic Toss back to back and finally took out Houndoom. He then brought out Weavile, so I switched into Dusknoir to try and avoid its ice moves, but he was hit with a critical Nightshade before even getting to move, fainting him then and there. Next was Crobat, who was dropped into the red after one Ice Punch and managed to get off a Confuse Ray before going down the next turn. Togekiss was next, who managed to get a lucky Energy Ball and Slack off from Metronome, but still went down after 2 Ice Punches. That left only my Roserade, who was in the red, and got outsped and KO'd with Ice Punch the next turn. In that battle, my entire team could only KO 1 Pokemon and got 1 other to half HP, while Cyrus still had 3 others and more full restores to use. After around 5 more attempts without making any progress, I immediately knew I'd have to grind. So I fainted back to the Pokemon Center and grinded in Mount Coronet until all my Pokemon were around level 55 to try again. I started doing some more attempts. Now, instead of starting with Roserade, I'd start with Togekiss and use Yawn in an attempt to set up Toxic Spikes, or switch into Steelix and roar Houndoom off the field. But almost every time, he'd wake up immediately and cause critical damage to my Pokemon, ruining my strategy and causing my team to wipe. I tried again and again, attempt after attempt failed. I never made it past the halfway mark and I started to lose hope. By now, I'd been at the challenge for almost 3 weeks. I'd spent entire days grinding and resetting for this battle, and I started to wonder if it was even possible. So I took a much needed break. After a few days, I found the motivation to try again, so I got up and started grinding. I spent half a day grinding my Pokemon even more until they were all at least level 60, and I came back to finish this fight once and for all. But for this time, I made a key switch. I swapped Crobat for Bronzong. I knew I needed Light Screen and Reflect because his Pokemon was so strong. I started off with Dusknoir and immediately used Curse. I knew I needed to get Houndoom off the field as soon as I could, so I swapped in Bibarel, who had also leveled up to tank Houndoom's hits while he went down. On the turn he was about to faint, I brought in Steelix and immediately switched to Roserade as Gyarados came out. Roserade tanked Gyarados long enough to set up Leech Seed and Toxic on him, and then Bronzong came in to put up Light Screen and Reflect. When Cyrus used a full restore, I sent in Dusknoir to try and burn him, but he was outsped and he fainted. So I brought out Steelix to set up Stealth Rock and stalled Protect to lower Gyarados' health from Leech Seed. And once my screens wore off, I brought in Bronzong to set them straight back up, and soon Gyarados went down as well. Next was Honchkrow. This was another one of his big threats. I swapped in Steelix to get it off the field due to it having Heat Wave because it was a huge problem, and Crobat came in. Luckily, Crobat couldn't do anything against my Steelix, and after chipping in with Stealth Rocks, I roared again, bringing in Weavile, then Honchkrow, and then Crobat again. I put him to sleep with Hypnosis and brought Roserade out to apply Leech Seed and set up Toxic Spikes. I swapped into Bronzong again to set up my screens, and luckily, Crobat went down. When Honchkrow came back out, I sent in Togekiss and confused it using Sweet Kiss. I started using Metronome and prayed for a good move, and although it took a few turns, I eventually got Flamethrower and it managed to take out Honchkrow. Weavile came out and was poisoned from the Toxic Spikes and already had half health from the Stealth Rock. After applying another Leech Seed, I swapped to Steelix to try and tank even more. Cyrus used a full restore, so I used Protect and Sandstorm to wait it out, and thanks to Leech Seed and Sandstorm, it finally went down. After 4 days, hours of grinding, I'd done it. Finally. Oh my god. After this, I took on Gardenia in an intense and drawn out battle. No, I'm joking. I threw a Master Ball on the very first turn and boxed him for the rest of the run. I couldn't be bothered with another big fight. After this, I hopped through a portal to the real world and headed to Sunyshore City. After making my way to Sunyshore, I went and spoke to Volkner at the lighthouse, before again struggling on a children's puzzle until I reached him. Considering the battle I just had, Volkner was going to be very easy. I started out with Roserade to set up Leech Seed, and then I set up Toxic Spikes and used Toxic on Jolteon. Then I swapped out to Steelix to use Stealth Rocks and protected until Jolteon went down. Next up was Raichu. He was hit with Stealth Rock and Toxic on entry before Roserade came in and Leech Seeded him again, and we whittled him down using Confuse Ray from Crobat. Luxray met the same fate, but this time Confused from Togekiss, and after Volkner used a full restore, I reset Toxic and waited him out. Finally was Electivire, who I brought in Dusknoir to use Curse and Roserade to use Leech Seed to send him down quickly. And with that, I had my final badge. I went down to the beach and got Waterfall and taught it to my other Bibarel, and after swimming through Route 223, I made it to Victory Road. Victory Road wasn't too challenging. I had to heal at the Pokémon Center a few times due to the amount of trainers there, but none of them posed a real challenge. And just like that, I'd finally made it to the Pokémon League. When I got to the Elite Four, I made some final preparations. I switched Bibarel out for my final team, I bought some items from the Pokemart, and I used any rare candies that I had in my inventory. But before I could take on the Elite Four, I had one final challenge. Barry. Like I've said a couple of times, his team's not too bad. He has Empoleon and Roserade, which are minor issues, but overall we dealt with him quite quickly and was ready to take on the Elite Four. Aaron was a comfortable start to the Elite Four. I led with Steelix to set up Stealth Rock, which dealt big damage to Yanmega and Vespiquen thanks to their 4x weakness to Rock. I rode his team around until Scizor appeared, and then swapped to Roserade to use Leech Seed and Toxic Spikes, and let Dusknoir burn it and confuse it until it fainted. Heracross was poisoned and confused into a quick KO, but Drapion couldn't be poisoned, so I used Curse and Will-O-Wisp while protecting with Steelix. After cycling through his team to burn the rest of his full restores, Yanmega finished itself off with a confused self-hit. Next up was Bertha. She led with Whiscash, giving me time to set Leech Seed, Toxic, and Toxic Spikes. After forcing out a full restore, I rotated in Bronzong to avoid the Sandstorm damage and stall it out using Leech Seed. Gliscor came in next and was handled with a Will-O-Wisp burn and more Leech Seed stall. Golem and Rhyperior both fell after Toxic and Screen setups, although I did use Curse on Rhyperior since it hit hard and I needed to get rid of it fast. Finally, Hippowdon came in. I used Taunt to stop it from using Yawn, and then cursed it for a clean finish. Then, Flint was up next. Compared to the previous two, he was a real step up in difficulty. I opened with Togekiss to use Yawn, and then rotated into Steelix to roar it away. Rapidash came in next, and I used the opening turns to set Leech Seed and Screens, though I lost Bronzong in the process. But then Crobat came in and stalled it out with Confuse Ray and Substitute until it went down. Magmortar came in next, and I had to use Curse immediately due to his high damage output. Then I used Protect and swapped my Pokemon to dodge Solar Beam, and waited for it to whittle down. Flareon came in after and got baited into using Giga Impact, allowing me to use a free switch into an immune Dusknoir, who waited for it to drop. Finally, Houndoom and Infernape came back in. They're both very dangerous, but I managed to stall them out with Curse, Disable and Roost. And in the end, only Crobat was left standing. Lucian was the final member of the four. His Mr. Mime opened with Reflect and Light Screen, so I mirrored that with Bronzong and landed a Hypnosis. Once asleep, I set up Toxic Spikes on Roserade and Sandstorm with Steelix, and he quickly went down. Glade was next, and it was dangerous, but it fell due to an early curse, and I could stall it out because I had my own screens up. Alakazam joined the field, and he was brutal. Bronzong took 3 Focus Blasts before fainting, but I managed to stall it out with Protect. Espeon followed and was instantly confused, then poisoned, and picked off slowly. And lastly, his own Bronzong came in, but it couldn't outlast the big damage from Curse and chip damage from Leech Seed. Then, it was time to face Cynthia. I didn't know what to expect going in, and after a few failed attempts, I put together a plan. She leads with Spiritomb, so I opened with Togekiss to use Yawn and Sweet Kiss, and once it was asleep and confused, I switched into Bronzong to set up Light Screen and Reflect, then put it back to sleep when it woke up. Then I brought in Roserade to lay down Toxic Spikes and apply Leech Seed to start recovering health. Cynthia used a full restore, but with Leech Seed active, Spiritomb's fate was sealed. I sent in Steelix to get Stealth Rock up, and Togekiss helped me tank hits until it finally went down. Her own Togekiss was next, and it lost a chunk of health due to Stealth Rock, but I rode it away with Steelix and brought out Garchomp instead. I switched into Crobat and stalled with Substitute. Garchomp got poisoned on entry, and quickly fainted from the confusion and Toxic. Togekiss came back out after that, so I brought in Dusknoir to try and burn it, but after flinching 3 times in a row, he fainted before landing a move. I brought Bronzong back out to reset my screens, and put Togekiss to sleep again. From there, Roserade came back in to apply Leech Seed, and I rotated my own Togekiss to stall with Yawn and chip damage. Then used Roserade once more to prepare for what came next. Her own Roserade. But before I could deal with it, she swapped into Lucario. Togekiss eventually fainted during the switch, and things were starting to look rough. I sent in Roserade to Leech Seed and paralyze her Lucario, then cycled between Bronzong and Crobat to take hits from it, and eventually it went down. My Lotic came in, but since I still had Roserade, this part was easy. I used Leech Seed and Toxic, and it went down in no time. Finally, Cynthia's Roserade was back. I managed to paralyze it with my own Roserade before it went down to a crit. I brought in Crobat for the last push, using Confuse Ray, Substitute and Roost, and after several turns of stalling, her Roserade knocked itself out. And with that, I became the champion of the Sinnoh region, without ever even attacking another Pokémon. This challenge pushed me a lot more than I expected it would. From building a team that could actually beat a champion without doing damage, to the amount of hours I put into grinding. It took time, effort, and a lot of trial and error. But in the end, I'm genuinely proud that I was able to do it. I'm still a small channel, and I'm just trying things out, but I'd love to keep doing more challenges like this. So if you enjoyed the video, or you've got an idea for another ridiculous run I could try, let me know below. And if you want to support the channel, or see what I do next, consider subscribing. But to end it on an honest note, thank you for watching this far. To make my first video was a big step, and I hope I can keep making more that people will enjoy.